Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Disgrace, Global Reflections on Sexual Violence by Joanna Bourke, narrated by Zehra J. Naqvi. Introduction. The Global Crisis. Wanda Coleman is one of my favourite poets. In 1983, she published Rape, which centres on a survivor of multiple sexual assaults. The poem addresses a crucial problem in societal attitudes towards rape. Victims, rather than those who perpetrate such egregious harms, are deemed disgraced. In Coleman's poem, a woman is raped. Her boyfriend blames her for not fighting to her death. He then rapes her as well. Two armed assailants who break into her home demand that she acts as if they are her lovers. They even kiss her goodbye afterwards, saying, "When you get lonely, call." The poem ends with the heartbreaking lines. She waited until she was sure they wouldn't come back and kill. She picked up the phone and made the mistake of thinking the world would understand. Coleman's poem echoes the experience of many survivors of rape. It rekindled my frustration and fury. It is a disgrace that victim survivors of sexual violence still discover that it is a mistake to think the world would understand. It is a disgrace that globally 1 in 5 girls and women will be sexually abused. It is a disgrace that some people minimize the sexual harms inflicted on people of different genders, sexualities, races, ethnicities, classes, castes, religions, ages, generations, body types, disabilities, and so on. Shame on boyfriends, lovers, and husbands for their casual sense of sexual entitlement. Shame on law enforcement officers who routinely disbelieve people who report having been abused. Shame on powerful people who use their authority to inflict sexual harms. The way rape survivors are treated in justice systems worldwide is a disgrace. It is a disgrace that, in 1970s Britain, only 1 in 3 cases of rape that were reported to the police ended in a conviction. Today, it is fewer than 1 in 20. After 40 years of feminist activism and legal reform, this is a disgrace. It is also outrageous that we still haven't devised effective, non-carceral ways of dealing with sexually violent people. The failure of so many good people to listen to those who have suffered abuse is something to lament. So too is the reluctance of many of us to join movements aimed at eradicating sexual violence. This book, therefore, is a call for action. Rape and sexual abuse are not inevitable in human cultures. Although the extent of sexual cruelty in the past and the present is often overwhelming, this form of violence can be contested and eradicated. As I hope to show, rape is culturally constructed. It varies widely across time and place. These differences provide clues for forging more harmonious, just and equal worlds. In this book, I will be delving into the factors that facilitate sexual abuse, including institutional, cultural, and ideological ones, as well as exploring patterns and practices. But I will also be looking at the various meanings that victims and perpetrators give to violent acts. Only knowledge of the diverse forms of cruelty, coupled with respectful attention paid to the lives of other people, will edge us towards a feminism that can eradicate the scourge of sexual violence throughout the world. Transnational tensions. This can only ever be a partial account of sexual violence, both physical and psychological, around the world. After all, forms of abuse are legion. 19th-century peasant women in Ireland who were abducted as a way of forcing marriage have little in common with date-raped high school students in 20th-century America. The girls and women violated by Red Army soldiers in 1945 cannot realistically be compared to Dalit women raped by men of higher castes today. The options available to sexually abused women in the occupied territories of Palestine, Rio's Favelas or Cité Soleil in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, are different to the protections open to German citizens. French wives who acquiesce to sexual intercourse with their husbands as the easier option bear no resemblance to bushwives in Sierra Leone. It matters if you are a boy, man or non-binary person. It makes a difference if the attacker wields a machete or raises the threat of an unsigned employment contract. There is always a risk of emphasizing similarities over differences. Any assumption that sexual violence is a universal experience insults the specificities of individual histories. Terror is always local. Terror is also unevenly distributed. One major school of second-wave feminism that developed in the West between the 1970s and 1990s contended that rape is indigenous, not exceptional, to women's social condition. Every female from 9 months to 90 years is at risk, and rape is a form of global terrorism. The most influential exposition of this view is Susan Brownmiller's insistence in her classic Against Our Will, 1975, that from prehistoric times to the present, rape has played a critical function. It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Brownmiller's book changed the way people throughout the world think about sexual violence. But this generalization is not tenable. Some people are more vulnerable than others. Girls and women are at higher risk, as are people who are BME, black and minority ethnic, refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, LGBTQ and non-binary, and those with physical or learning disabilities. Crucially, these identities are not discrete badges of vulnerability. Their effects are cumulative. This is the point that Kimberly Crenshaw made most forcefully in her influential article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, 1989. Crenshaw is a legal academic and one of the founders of critical race theory. Her essay introduced a crucial concept for this book, intersectionality. Crenshaw points out that the focus of white feminists in the West on the most privileged group members, that is, other white women, marginalizes those who are multiply burdened. It is not enough to simply add black women to an already established analytical structure. This is because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism. So any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which black women are subordinated. In other words, to understand sexual violence in global contexts, attention must be paid not simply to sex discrimination or racial prejudices, but to the compounding effects of race, sex, gender, class, caste, religion, disability, age, generation, and so on. It's complicated. Crenshaw's intersectional approach requires us to be attentive to the complexities of people's lives. This complexity is one of many complicating features when exploring sexual violence transnationally. Many of these difficulties are discussed in later chapters, but in this introduction, I want to focus on 4 problems. These are defining what is meant by sexual violence, quantifying it, ensuring that survivors are not only heard but also safeguarded, and paying attention to language. The first question that must be addressed is, what is meant by sexual violence? We can agree that it includes rape, sexual assault, sexualized abuse, and non-consensual sexual activity. But what about consensual sexual activity between people under the legal age of consent? Or female genital cutting? Or the circumcision of boys? Sex trafficking is a form of violence, but is voluntary sex work by adult women worried about how to feed their children also abusive? When a male stranger brandishes a knife, it is easy to assume that a violent act is being perpetrated. But what about when a husband gradually wears down a no? What if a girl or woman hastily marries a man solely in the hope that he will protect her from armed violence from other men? For the purposes of this book, I will adopt the definition that I used in Rape, a history from the 1860s to the present, 2007. In that book, sexual violence was defined as any act identified as such by a participant, victim, or third party. The suffering of infants, very young children, and those with severe learning disabilities can only be described by third parties. So long as someone says that an act is rape, sexually abusive, or sexually violent, that claim is accepted. The definition also allows for multiple definitions of what is sexual. After all, what is regarded as sexual has changed over time and by geographical region. It allows for culturally distinctive and time-specific definitions of non-consensual, unwanted, or coerced, all of which vary widely. The definition enables us to problematize and historicize every component of the complex interactions between sexed bodies. This definition is also skeptical about legal dogmas. Throughout the world, the law is parsimonious about what it designates as violent sexual behavior. It fears the criminalization of ordinary male misbehavior. Vast differences exist between jurisdictions. Is rape an act against the will of a victim or without her consent? Does it require emission of semen? Can a man be violated? The evidence required to prove that a rape occurs fluctuates. Is proof of violence necessary? Does there need to be a witness? Can the victim's sexual history be submitted as evidence? Punishments range from a verbal reprimand, fine or whipping to imprisonment, castration or death. Furthermore, laws around sexual violence can be dramatically transformed within short periods of time. For example, one day marital rape is legally impossible, the next it is a heinous crime. An adult who has sex with a person under the age of consent is by law engaging in a criminal act. But the legally binding age changes by a simple legislative vote, which can differ considerably when an offender steps across a state line. In the USA at the end of the 19th century, for example, the difference between the ages at which a girl's yes was legally deemed to be meaningful could be as young as 10 in Mississippi and Alabama and as high as 18 in Kansas and Wyoming. Throughout the globe, variations in the age of consent were linked to ideas about the onset of puberty, different expectations of childhood, shifting views about the innocence or culpability of infants and youth, and the strength of feminist and other activist movements. As we will see in the next chapter, in many legal domains, victims of sexual violence are either voiceless or silenced. If the first difficulty is definitional, the second is quantitative. There are a host of impediments to assessing the extent of sexual violence. We don't know how many people perpetrated rape, We don't know how many people they victimized. Various statistics will be mentioned in this book. They don't reflect the true incidence of crime. They don't even reflect police knowledge of crime. The only thing that is certain is that the statistics are substantial underestimates. Underreportage is rife due to the reluctance of victims to publicly complain. When they do report abuse, their protests are routinely not heard, let alone responded to. The statistics are usually based on the willingness of survivors to speak out, or they are extrapolated from the number of victims who seek medical treatment or legal redress. As a result, these victims are probably not typical ones. Even when statistics are painstakingly collected, comparisons are often impossible. For example, sometimes the number of people convicted of sexual offences is recorded, while more recently there has been a shift to counting victims instead of perpetrators. Innumerable factors can cause sudden and dramatic shifts in reportage. Changes in the number of police available to apprehend criminals, the willingness of people to refer crimes to the police, and the relative ranking of crimes, which means that some are pursued more vigorously than others, all distort the numbers. The statistical inadequacies should not daunt us, however. Sexual violence is a problem. The fact that you are listening to this book is proof that you are as determined as I am to understand and eradicate this scourge within our communities. Safeguarding survivors. The third challenge for a transnational history of sexual violence is ensuring that survivors are placed centre stage. For centuries, male-biased legal and penal systems have adjudicated on what is sexually abusive. These authoritative voices claim an exclusive privilege to dictate responses to it. Equally, the speech of perpetrators of rape has echoed loudly through time, insisting that they have a right to define what constitutes sexual aggression. The claims of abused people, by contrast, have been routinely questioned, if not disparaged, suppressed, and silenced. Paying attention to their voices is important if we are to understand not only the struggles of people in the past, but, in addition, the meaning of violence itself. However, paying attention to the voices of victims is complicated, and in very pragmatic as well as philosophical ways. There is the risk of stripping victims of agency. This point was made most eloquently by African and Caribbean literary scholar Regine Michel Jean Charles. She reminds scholars about the need to present African women as advocates, survivors and agitators, rather than only as victims and vessels of violation. These women were not the passive female victims who had been subject to countless violations in Africa's World War. These were not submissive receptacles of violence, left for dead on the side of the road. These were not brutalized and victimized women in need of a Western vehicle to make their voice audible. They are subjects rather than objects in their own lives. There is a great deal at stake in her argument, including anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and anti-essentialism. Writing and speaking about sexual abuse can also re-violate people who have already suffered harms. One way this might happen is through the intrusion of voyeuristic impulses. Mary Hames, director of the Gender Equity Unit at the University of the Western Cape, warned against this during a roundtable on violence against lesbians in South Africa. After admitting that the most difficult thing to share in a public audience is your own life experience, she cautioned participants to be careful, sensitive about issues like this, because I believe, even in an audience like this, there's a lot of voyeurs just looking into other people's pain. The conveners of the workshop, Nonlanla Nkeze, Jane Bennett, Vasu Reddy, Relebohile Moletsane concurred, adding that, in a context in which part of homophobia involves the overt sexualization of lesbians for heterosexual men's consumption, and one in which violence is both glorified and exoticized by vast swathes of media discourse, including music, television, advertisements, soft pornography, and sensation-driven daily newspapers, public discourse on the violence meted out against black lesbians runs the risk of being simply the scandal of the day. Victim speech ends up eliciting voyeurism rather than outrage. Such ethical fissures were starkly exposed in reportage of mass rapes during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. Hundreds of journalists and Western NGOs appeared, demanding to interview rape victims and even entering maternity hospitals in Sarajevo and Zagreb, seeking out women who had become pregnant through rape. They rarely provided financial or psychological assistance to victims who shared their experiences. Some were remarkably lax in maintaining confidentiality, naming victims or publishing photographs of their homes. Others interviewed girls and women in front of their families or members of their community. Was it any wonder that activists such as Jovanka Stoch-Savlajevic fumed against the publication of articles and books containing gratuitous details of women's experiences of rape, stripping rape victims of their ability to voice their own trauma? If one way to silence victim survivors was by failing to respect either their privacy or their strategies for coping, another involved appropriating their trauma to serve an agenda not shared by the victims themselves. This was the problem identified by gender scholar Wendy Hesford in her critique of Catherine A. McKinnon's often quoted article, Turning Rape into Pornography, 1993. McKinnon's article had been published in the American liberal feminist Ms. magazine, and it situated mass rapes in Yugoslavia within a very North American discourse about pornography. McKinnon claimed that pornography was both a motivator and instruction manual for the rape atrocities in Yugoslavia. Hesford disagreed. She castigated McKinnon for constructing a fairly simplistic cause and effect relationship between the consumption of pornography and the sexualization of torture. Hesford maintained that McKinnon not only reproduces a model of spectacular uniqueness and individuality that leads only to repeated trauma, but employs the particularities of rape warfare in Bosnia, as conveyed through anonymous women's testimonies, to support a universal claim about pornography. In other words, rather than paying attention to the specificities of the atrocities in the former Yugoslavia, McKinnon co-opted the testimonies of rape survivors in a way that privileges the rhetorical gaze of North American feminism as beyond nation or nationalism. In a trenchant statement, Hesford accused McKinnon of being more interested in linking human rights violations, in this case rape warfare, to her anti-pornography stance than she is in exploring these women's testimonials for what they say about the complexities of women's victimization and agency and the politics of nationalism and transnational feminism. In this way, McKinnon created a universalized misogyny, as pornography, at work worldwide, with no distinction among sites. What happened in Bosnia was rendered identical to what happens to women in brothels or pornographic film sets throughout the world. The specificities of the victims' lives were erased. The appropriation of other people's trauma to serve the political interests of journalists and academic researchers is especially pertinent where there are vast disparities in power between the protagonists. In such contexts, Are victim survivors even capable of giving meaningful consent? Getele J. Rahil, Manisha Joshi, and Whitney Shadowans addressed this question during their research with victims of sexual violence in Haiti's Cité Soleil. The lack of privacy in this densely populated and extremely poor shanty town meant that both victims and their assailants were well known within their communities. Survivors were therefore highly apprehensive about being seen talking to researchers. Might it result in further violence if perpetrators believed that the women were planning joint action against them? Power differentials between rape victims and interviewers also intruded. These highly vulnerable women regarded the three researchers as authorities, which made informed consent impossible. Rahil, Joshi, and Shadowans observed that victims of kadejak, rape, and their neighbours are often quick to provide consent before they fully understand the purpose of the proposed research or the benefits and risks associated with it. The victims are eager to tell their stories, and when we are time-pressed and resource-limited, the temptation is to advance rapidly, especially since many of the victims have completed less than 6 years of formal education, and reading the consent form aloud to each one individually is taxing. Destitute, semi-literate survivors of rape had already been stripped of human dignity. Were academic researchers going to compound this by interviewing them for the purposes of academic research and the rewards that accompany subsequent publication without obtaining their meaningful consent as well? Harm might not only be done to survivors. Publicly exposing sexual violence can also have devastating effects for others, especially when the perpetrators belong to the victim's own minoritized community. This was recognized by early researchers exploring sexual abuse within gay or male communities. By revealing sexual abuse within this beleaguered community, researchers risked tarnishing all homosexuals as perverted. It was a problem that feminists and social workers faced when they began disseminating evidence that underage white working-class girls in Rochdale in Greater Manchester were being groomed for sex by Asian men. Newspapers sensationalized the abuse, leading to the vilification of the South Asian community. These same newspapers routinely failed to identify other perpetrators of sexual violence as a problem of white Protestants, for example. Exposés can cement damaging stereotypes, such as those concerning rapacious black men. Jean Charles expresses this problem succinctly, complaining that Western commentators exploring the war in the Congo slipped too quickly into a problematic Conradian landscape of primordial violence, imaging the primitive heart of darkness. As we will see throughout this book, this naturalization of the violence of black men is not uncommon. It is what infuriated Haitian researchers, who objected to being regularly contacted by American scholars and asked to comment on the way unbridled levels of sexual violence in Haiti were responsible for spreading HIV and AIDS. Such requests fueled further racism against Haitian boys and men. It was no wonder they turned to the Haitian proverb, "Radsal senan fan miyo laveyo." Dirty laundry is done in the context of the family. The naturalization of colonialist views about violent black men can be illustrated by looking at international responses to what has become known as the New Delhi gang rape case of 2012, when Jyoti Singh and her male friend were tortured. After being raped, Singh was killed. The incident resulted in massive protests within India and elsewhere in the world, leading to significant legal reforms. However, Indian feminists were dismayed by much of the commentary from the West. First, They noted that it exposed a colonialist mindset within First World feminism that disregarded the anti-rape activism conducted by black men and women.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?